Welcome everybody. I'm extremely excited. I've wanted to meet Professor Stiles for a long time.
Likewise.
Sure. So her book, the exact title of which escapes me, is Sharia Court in East Africa?
An Islamic court in context. Yes, something
This
like
book is so good.
Thank you.
I really cannot say enough good stuff about it. It's a page turner. It does such a good job of helping, I think, readers just to think more just concretely about how Islamic law works in one place in practice. And tragically, it's not $20.
Not $20.
And that's the only thing that prevents me from making all my students buy it. Is it's a little on the steep side. But I think, and it's also not an ebook. I don't think, which is.
Oh, it's not.
I don't think it's but I don't think we have it in our library. And it's an excellent book. Really, I cannot say enough good stuff about this book. So, Professor Stiles is from the Department of Anthropology. She's a cultural anthropologist from the University of Nevada, and she chairs the minor program there in religious studies. Her research focuses on the intersection of religion, law, and gender, and she conducts field work in East Africa and in Utah. We're discussing her field work about spirit possession in Utah.
Not possession.
Spirit
just
visitation. My bad.
That's
I
it's okay.
Unaware of these things. Spirit visitation in Utah. Much of her research has examined Islamic legal practice, particularly concerning divorce and marital disputes in Zanzibar's Qadi courts. The floor is yours. Educate
All right.
us.
Thank you so much. So let me figure out how to use the clicker. Oh, great. Okay.
Do you want to stand up there or sit down?
I don't know. What? Is it better to stand? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to Georgetown. This is my first visit here, and it's very beautiful campus, beautiful part of DC. So I texted my husband, I'm ready to move. It's gorgeous. So as Jonathan noted, I have done most of my research as an anthropologist in Zanzibar, which is a semi-autonomous island state of Tanzania, on the practice of Islamic law in Qadi courts, which are part of the state legal system. I was actively doing field work for quite some time between 1999 and 2008, and then I started having children, and so I have been doing more comparative work, and I haven't done ethnographic work in Tanzania since then, but hopefully I'm going back this summer, so fingers crossed the whole family can go. We're still waiting to figure out if that's going to be possible, and so I've been doing I've been continuing. What I'm going to talk about today is how I've kind of updated some of the work that I did for the book that Jonathan was talking about with on a comparative project on a particular type of divorce with some colleagues working in other parts of the world, as I will note. And then I've also started doing research. It's very, very different from this, on spirit visitations in a Mormon community in northern Utah. So, but that's not going to make it into the talk today. So what I'm going to be talking about is a form of divorce known as hula, or Khuluu in Swahili, and I'll be using Swahili forms for legal terms throughout the talk today, since that's the language spoken in Zanzibar. I'm going to be talking about interpretations of Khuluu that are commonly used in Islamic courts in Zanzibar. So this is, let's see, actually. Okay. Oh, wait, no, wrong way. Hang on. Okay. All right, so most of the slides in here, most of the photos are photos that I've taken. They're not always super relevant to what I'm saying, but they're pretty. But this is the community that I worked in Zanzibar. So, and I'll show some maps a little bit later. So this project is, the Hula project is something that I've been working on with some colleagues, all anthropologists or socio-legal scholars. And what we are doing is, or what I'm doing today is I'm talking about my contribution to a special edition of Islamic Law and Society that's hopefully going to come out at the end of this end of this calendar year, maybe very early in 2019. And I'm editing it with Nadia Sonneveld, who is an anthropologist based in Leiden in the Netherlands, who studied hula in Egypt. And we're working with all of these this the pointer? All right, all of these anthropologists and sociolegal scholars here to look at contemporary manifestations of this particular type of divorce, which I'll tell you more about in a moment. And I'm looking at Zanzibar, Nadia's looking at Egypt and Morocco, Sylvia Vadek is looking at India, Stein van Heijs is looking at Indonesia, and Esther van Eyck is working on hula in courts in the Netherlands, and Mahmoud Jaraba is working on hula in Germany. And my contribution is, again, like I said, a re-examination of some of the work that I did previously in Zanzibar with some new materials that I've been able to gather since then. So hula is one of many types of Islamic divorce. It's often been referred to in the literature as a divorce by women's prerogative, or sometimes a divorce of mutual agreement. And what I'm looking at is hula in Zanzibar, which is actually used far more often as a judicial tool to end a marriage. And so I'm referring to, so the title of the talk is Judicial Khuluu, because it's very, very commonly used in courts in Zanzibar in order to end a marriage by the decision of a judge. And I'll tell you about why this is the case. And so one of the things that what we've all been doing, I guess, with the hula project is looking at variations and interpretations and practice of hula in various contemporary contexts. And so I'll do some more, I'll look at a little bit, I'll close the talk with looking a bit more comparatively about how judicial hulu in Zanzibar resembles or doesn't resemble contemporary utilizations of this type of divorce in other parts of the world. All right, so hula, again, is often characterized as divorce by women's prerogative or divorce by mutual consent. It's the commonly cited sources for hula are Quran 2:229. There's a couple other verses as well. This is the one that I've chosen to put up here, and you can read for yourselves, so I won't read. And then the hadith of Habiba from Bukhari, narrated by Ibn Abbas, where the Prophet says right here, accept your garden and divorce her at once, where Habiba, or sometimes in some reports it's Jamila, I used Habiba here, where the Prophet asked her to give back the garden which her husband has given her in exchange for divorce, and the garden was given as her mahar, and that becomes very important, of course, when we're talking about hula across context. So those are the sources, the primary legal sources for hula. And what I've noted, or what we've all noted in the comparative research we're doing on the contemporary practice of hula, and we don't have any historians involved in the projects. We're looking pretty, well, I guess Stein van Heijs does, it takes a little bit more of a historical view, but we're all doing ethnographic research on this in the contemporary period. The common denominator for hula is a woman compensating her husband for a divorce, whether or not she desires the divorce. And again, in many contexts, the divorce is initiated by the woman and she compensates her husband in return, but also there are lots of examples, like the Zanzibar example, where she is not asking for a hula, but she ends up compensating her husband for a divorce for reasons that I will talk through. And of course, the compensation, again, as you can see from the hadith, is tied to her marriage gift, or her mahar. And then from here on out, I'll use the Swahili term. So in Swahili, mahar is mahari, and so I'll be using that one throughout. And so the reason I put this slide up here, because I think these are some friends and acquaintances in the part of Zanzibar where I work, but I like the contrast of these two pictures because it shows you what in this cultural context men and women are responsible for in terms of their marriage. So a man needs to provide a house, so that is his responsibility. A woman usually provides what are known as vyombo in Swahili, which are household goods. She brings that into the marriage. And most often she does the cooking, she does the household maintenance, she does the care for the children, but that is not understood to be her legal responsibility. However, providing a house, providing food, providing clothing are absolutely legal responsibilities for the husband. So that'll come up when we look more at the judicial reasoning that goes into determining when Khuluu in Swahili happens. Okay, so in other parts of the world, not in Zanzibar, since the late 20th century, there have been some recent legal reforms concerning hula, which Lynn Welchman has titled, or what she terms the third wave of legal reform, that have undertaken to make divorce more equitable for women. And so Pakistan was actually the first to introduce unilateral hula as a judicial divorce demanded on the part of the wife without the consent of the husband in the late 20th century. The Egypt case is probably most well known. There's been a lot of research on that, but in 2001, Egypt introduced unilateral hula as a judicial divorce on the request of the wife without the consent of the husband.
Sorry, quick question. Does that mean unilateral means the judge has to approve it, or it's unilateral without the judge's approval?
Oh, the judge approves. The judge approves, sorry.
Without the consent of the husband?
Without the consent of the husband, yes.
The consent of the husband?
No, Pakistan also without the consent of the husband. Yes, so this one was also without the consent of the husband. Egypt was without the consent of the husband as well. In 2001, it was very controversial in Egypt. So Nadia Sanavald has written a great book on controversies surrounding hula. Other scholars have looked at this as well. And then Jordan, Algeria followed Egypt and introduced similar legislation to Egypt's following Egypt's legislation from 2001. So, and in most cases, the goal. The goal, of course, was to make divorce rights more equitable between the husband and the wife. And again, like I mentioned, Lynn Welchman has characterized this as the third wave of legal reform in Muslim-majority countries that have sought to expand women's access to divorce. So, Zanzibar was not part of this wave. All right, so Zanzibar was not part of this wave of legal reform. And in fact, in Zanzibar, there's no legislation, there's no statutory law, there's no family law code that's relevant to marriage and divorce. So, so I'll tell you a little bit about the legal system. I'll just point out the maps. So this is a map that my husband, I like to give him credit because he designed my maps for me, but I don't always remember to thank him for that. So Edward Allen, thank you for designing this beautiful map. But so you can see this right here. So here's Zanzibar, the islands that make up Zanzibar. And again, Zanzibar is a semi-autonomous island state of Tanzania. It's a majority Muslim. It's about, the population's just over 1 million, and it's almost 99% Muslim, something like that. So overwhelmingly Muslim population. Tanzania as a whole is probably about 30% Muslim. People argue over that number. But Zanzibar, the semi-autonomous means that Zanzibar has its own president, parliament, and legal system. And the legal system in Zanzibar makes provisions for Islamic courts as part of the state legal system. And they're known as Qadi courts. And they have jurisdiction over all personal status matters for Muslims. So that includes marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody. Though child custody is often debated about whether it should be in the Islamic courts or in the state civil courts. The Qadis who preside over the courts are state appointments, and they're hired based on their reputation as religious scholars. They're nominally appointed by the president of Zanzibar, so but they're based on reputation. Some people think politics is involved. I'm not 100% sure. I'm sure it is to some extent, but in my research, I've never felt confident talking about the political aspects, the political nature of appointments. I have a little bit, but I mean, I can talk about it in a presentation, but I've never felt comfortable really writing about it because I'm really not quite sure. All right. So what I've noted is that there are essentially 3 forms of hulu in Zanzibar. So there's the judicial hulu, which I'm going to be talking about, which is a judge deciding that a marriage should end in hulu. So a judge is making that decision. And that's very important because what I've seen in Zanzibar is that it almost never requested by women. It's requested slightly more often by husbands. This is the divorce by women's prerogative, but it's very, very rarely requested by women in Zanzibar, and I'll explain why in the talk. There's also what we can refer to as extrajudicial hulu, so hulu that's taking place outside of the court. Maybe a husband and a wife agree to divorce through mutual consent, and the wife offers some sort of compensation. I know that this probably happens at some points, but in all of my research, I've done ethnographic research in courts and outside of courts, and women have told me only very, very rarely, and I've done probably about 100 interviews, 100 recorded interviews, many, many more informal conversations, and I've only had 2 women say that they actually requested hulu outside of the court. So it's very uncommon from what I can gather. And there's also something that Judith Tucker referred to as false hulu, and Elka Stockrider is a historian who works in Zanzibar, also refers to it as false hulu. I refer to it as writing for money. And so this is, in Swahili, there's a term called kuandikia pesa, which means to write for money. And so what this is a form of, it's something that is most likely derived from hula, but it's when a husband asks his wife to compensate him for a divorce that he wants. So it's kind of like asking her to pay him for a unilateral talaq. So, and this definitely happens in Zanzibar. Men do not admit to doing this, but lots of women have said that they've been divorced through this method. Lots of the legal scholars and the qadis that I've worked with know that this happens, and so they're actually on the watch for it in court, and they try to figure out if people have been divorced outside of a court, they try to determine whether or not it was a valid sort of unilateral repudiation, or whether a husband asked to be compensated for a divorce that he was initiating. So I refer to that as, yes?
All these 2 or 3 forms they are equally binding.
Well, no,
You
this,
could go either way. I mean, it's option.
this one, all right, so the false one is not if it shows up in court. So if a woman comes to court and says, for example, my husband divorced me and I want the certificate of divorce from the court so I can go ahead and remarry or whatever. They'll call in the husband, and then they'll figure out what the terms of that divorce were. And if it turns out that he wrote her for money with a false hula, the judge won't qualify that as a divorce. However, if the woman never brings it to court, and that would be the most likely case, then it'll stand in the community as a divorce. So that's a great question, but it depends on, for these two, absolutely. If it's an extrajudicial hula where people agree, then that would stand up in court, though I've almost never seen that happen. The judicial hula, absolutely, the judge is deciding that that's a valid divorce. But if it's this one, the false one, if it comes to the court's attention and the judge has to rule on whether or not that's valid, then he won't. And that sometimes, yeah.
It doesn't have to be validated by a judge.
No.
It could be without
Yeah, it could be. So yeah, because so that's a great question. So men in Zanzibar may divorce their wives unilaterally without recourse to the court, and so that's what. So with the false one, yeah, the judge would be deciding whether or not it was a valid talaka, which is the Swahili word, or if it was kuandikia pesa, which would be an invalid form of divorce. So yeah, that's a great.
Because divorce does not have to be official. It just a man says Stiles.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, people are supposed to register it, but it's valid even if it's not registered. So most divorces happen outside of the court. Yeah, and most divorces happen through men repudiating their wives outside of the court. And there's very little stigma. Divorce is really common in Zanzibar. Most people are divorced at one point over the course of their lives, and there's almost no stigma attached to it. The only stigma I've seen is if a man divorces wives frequently, and then he will get a reputation as being kind of a bad man. But for women are usually viewed in the community as being the victims of divorce rather than, so there's very little stigma attached to it. And most people I knew one couple that passed away not long ago in their 70s and had been married to each other since they were very, very young, and that was it's hard to think of any other examples. I mean, I have some younger couples who haven't divorced, but it's quite common, and there's very, very little stigma, very little if any stigma attached to it, and then the stigma would mostly be a man who divorces his wife frequently. Yeah.
So if divorces aren't often registered at the court, are marriages registered at the court?
They're supposed to be, but they're not always. For marriages, there are marriage officers. There are lots of people. They don't have to be registered at the court. So there are people like religious teachers who might have a book of marriage certificates, and so that person can officiate the marriage and then write out, and then he'll have the contract that each party can sign. But pardon?
It's a form. It's a formal
form. Yeah. So, but they're not always submitted to the court. So, and then the remarriage part. And so then, depending on who's remarrying you, some people would ask for your certificate, some proof that you'd been divorced, and some won't. So it kind of depends on who's officiating that marriage. And so, if a woman wants to remarry, and the person who's officiating the marriage says, "I need to see proof that you were divorced from the court," then she might show up and ask to have a cheti cha talaka, which is like a divorce receipt from the court. And usually what happens then is the court will call in the husband and figure out the terms of the divorce. So, yes. So far, so good?
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, great. All right, so, okay, yeah, so what I've noted then, to kind of summarize, is that the Zanzibari Qadis don't simply grant hulu at the unilateral request of the wife, because she almost never, and I'll show you some figures to show you just how almost never this is, asks for a hulu when she goes to court to file for divorce. Women often come to court for divorce, but they seek what they call talaka bure, a free divorce, which would be a fas, or fasihi in Swahili. So we'll talk about that more in a second. So what I've noted is that judges frequently end, well, depending on the judge, we'll talk about that too, they're not granting hulu at the request of the wife, as we see in Egypt or Pakistan, but they impose it when they determine a wife to be at fault in the breakdown of the marriage. So it's lots of divorces end in hulu, but it's not because the woman is she's not asking for a hulu, as we would see, say, in Egypt or Pakistan. Okay, so this is a close-up map of where I've done my work. So this is Unguja, which is the more populated island of Zanzibar. About 70% of the population lives on this big island. About 30% lives here, really small. About 10,000, well, maybe 20,000 people live on this little island of Tumbatu right here. So one of the courts that I've worked in is in Mkokotoni, and one of the courts I've worked in is in Mfenesini. I've also worked a teeny bit in the main, the largest, I should say, district Islamic court in Zanzibar town, but I haven't done a lot of work there. So this is, I'll talk mostly about Mkokotoni because that's where I've done most of my work, and I have more records going back to 1979 from that court. And then I'll just give one example of a case from the other court in Mfenesini to show how judges are differ in terms of how they'll decide to use hulu or not. The same understanding of what it should be and what it is, but they choose to use it different, or one chooses not to use it because he believes it's too punitive. And this is the house I always live in when I go to Zanzibar, so pretty, so got that picture. And then again, thank you to Edward Allen for designing the maps. All right, so first of all, I'm going to talk about the Mkokotoni court where I've worked, where I've done most of my research. So I have the records from this court going back to about 1979, and in perusing the records, I've noted that there are usually about between 40 and 50 cases open in this court per year. The court has jurisdiction over a rural region of about 100,000 people, 130,000 people, and again, primarily rural region in the very northernmost part of Unguja. There's 6 primary courts on this island, and there are 3 on the other island. All right, so about 80% of the cases are opened by women. The most common reason for opening a case is a woman requesting maintenance, back maintenance, or from her husband, so her husband is not supporting her properly. And then the second largest category is women requesting a divorce from the court. But again, they're almost always requesting a fuss, or they're not specifying, or they're wanting a free divorce, which in Swahili would be talaka bure. A holo divorce is known colloquially in Swahili as kununua talaka, which is buying a divorce. Lay people don't often use the term hulu. Most people know what it is, but they'll use the term kununua talaka. So I don't want to, sipendi kununua talaka, meaning I don't want to buy my divorce, meaning I don't want a hula. She doesn't want to pay her husband for the divorce. All right, and we'll talk more about that. So in this period, between 1979 and 2005, there are over 1,200 cases open in the court. And out of all of these, I could only find 2 where a woman came to court requesting a hula. And even those they did not use this term. So it was a lot of sleuthing to find them. And basically in these cases, women were requesting to pay their husbands for the divorce. So again, they weren't using the term hulu, or I should say the court clerks who were recording it weren't using this term. But of all of these, and I have perused these records, there were only 2 where a woman was requesting a hula, so hardly any. And out of 12, not all of these were requests for divorce. This is a total number of cases, but very, very few. In the same time period, there were 4 men who came to court requesting a hulu. So again, not a very significant number. It's only 4, but twice as many as women came for this divorce by women's prerogative. So in Zanzibar, women do not want this kind of divorce.
Is that because the isma is in the hands of the woman?
Pardon?
When a man asks for the khuluu,
Yes.
is it because we have this arrangement where the isma, it's called the isma, is in the hands of the woman? She's the one who decides for the divorce in the contract? No, it's not a contractual thing. That's a great question. No, the women had left them. And so they came requesting to be compensated for divorce because their wives didn't want to be with them anymore. So that was what and then I'll tell you, I'll tell you why this is the case based in the Zanzibari context. So again, like I mentioned, it's a very common part of judicial practice, even though people aren't requesting it. And the judges generally see it as a punitive measure. So they see it as a punitive measure, and it's a way, it's appropriate to use when a wife is at fault for the marriage breakdown. And so this is kind of the crux of it in Zanzibar, that hula is seen as a way to sort of, well, I mean, they wouldn't, some of them refer to specifically as punishment, and more common, this qadi refers to it as a fine. And so it's appropriate, so it's deemed an appropriate type of divorce when a woman is deemed to be responsible for the failure of the marriage. So I have never seen anything that could be called no-fault divorce in Zanzibar. Somebody's always at fault in the cases that I've worked on, and if it's the wife who's at fault, it results in a Khuluu, where she has to buy her divorce. If the husband's at fault, it results in a fusk, or what people sometimes translate as annulment. But no money changes hands. And one point, I can't remember if I put it on a slide, but one point is really important point here is the mahari, or the mahar, that is mandatory part of the marriage contract in Zanzibar, and this rural part of Zanzibar is almost always paid promptly at the time of marriage. And so this is a really key point. So where we might see in other places, Esther Van Eyck's work in Syria, for example, the mahar is not paid promptly. So if a woman is getting a hula, she's forfeiting future rights to her dower, to her mahar, whereas in Zanzibar, usually a woman is expected to pay back all of the mahari she received when she was married, or sometimes even more, depending on the qadi and depending on the arrangements between the family. And so it really is a huge expense. I mean, the maharis are not huge. I mean, compared to other parts of the world, the maharis are not huge here. However, it is not a wealthy part of East Africa. And in this area, when I've done research, the mahari could be anywhere between $50 to $200, but that's significant. But when I first started doing research with the qadi, a qadi's salary was under $100 for a month. So it's a significant chunk of money. It can be a significant chunk of money. All right, and then again, that kind of corresponds with this reference to it as a faini in Swahili, which is taken from the English word fine, that it's a fine for a woman for causing the fault in her marriage. All right, so one case, I'm just going to give you an example, and then I have an excerpt from the ruling, so you can see how this qadi is using it. So this case was opened by a woman who was about 30 years old, Mtesi, against her husband, and she opened it as a pretty standard claim for maintenance. She argued that her husband had not been maintaining her properly for the last 10 months or something like that. I remember the examples, the details exactly. Her husband came in Makame, and he disputed all of her claims. He said, no, actually my wife left me. It wasn't that I wasn't maintaining her, it's that she left me without permission, etc. So what happens is, and the qadi that I worked with most, he really believed in marriage, and he often referred to the court as a hospital. So what we're doing is we are trying to fix people's marriages. And so when people come to see me, and he used that metaphor a lot, that the court is a hospital. If you're sick with an illness, you go to the hospital and they give you medicine and they fix you. If you're sick in your marriage, you come to me and I try to fix your marriage. And so he almost always tried to get disputing couples to reconcile. Almost always. He would hardly ever agree to a divorce right away. But as we'll talk about, he always left room for divorce. So with this couple, Mtesi and Makame, he issues very standard terms of reconciliations, and they were very formulaic, and he put them in most of his rulings for reconciliation. And he'd say the wife would have to return to her husband if she'd left him, live in his house, use polite language with him, and then let him know if she was leaving the house. So those are the wife's requirements almost always. The husbands were to support his wife, to support their children, to provide clothing, cooking oil, food, to speak nicely to his wife, etc. And so those are very standard. And I'll show that to you right now. And then these I will read. And I've translated all of this so these are my translations from the Swahili. So to the wife, and so this is a standard reconciliation. You're required to fulfill and follow these terms. If you fail to follow them, you'll be at fault according to the laws of marriage. And if you do this, it will be necessary to hulu your marriage, meaning that you will buy your divorce by order of the laws of marriage. Then to her husband, Makame, and these, again, very standard language, is almost identical from case to case. You must follow these terms through your actions, and if you ignore them, you'll be at fault according to the law. And if you do this, then your wife will be able to annul your marriage according to the laws of marriage by the means of faskihi. And if she annuls the marriage, she will be divorced according to the law. And so again, this is very, very formulaic. And as you can see, he's clearly associating hulu with the wife's fault and fasihi with the husband's fault. So he's setting out the terms. And again, the terms, I didn't include the terms here, but those things, those kind of standard things. Wife, Mtesi, you need to go back to your husband. You need to speak kindly to him. You need to tell him if you're leaving the house. Sometimes he'd say you need to ask permission. Usually it was just informing your husband husband, and then the husband would, of course, be required to support her appropriately, to support their children, provide for the house, make sure the house was in good repair, etc. And so then if they broke those, and so he always, and so I kind of think of this as an out. So for every ruling, there's an out. And so Mtesi was not happy with this reconciliation at all. She came in asking for maintenance, and that's how her case was opened. But through the proceedings of the case, and I sat in the court for hours and hours and hours every week listening to these cases, she mentioned that if her husband wouldn't pay this back maintenance, and she wanted to have a divorce. But the Qadi, again, this Qadi did not, he didn't like divorce. He really wanted everybody. I mean, I've seen couples where you could like cut the tension with they were so tense they would, back to back, wouldn't even look at each other, and the judge is still kind of saying, no, you can try, you can go for it, so you can make this work. So, and usually what would happen is that, well, I'll tell you, because he told in this case. So he gave this reconciliation, and he wrote it up, and then they each had to sign it. Makame signed it right away. It was kind of what he wanted. And Mtesi wouldn't sign it at all. She was really unhappy with it. And she was very, 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 the Qadi was kind of looking at her as very mkaidi, very stubborn. And then he thought, well, maybe she doesn't know how to write. And so he had someone get an ink pad so she could stamp her thumbprint. And that's how people would sign if they couldn't. Most people could write their names. But if they couldn't write their name, they would do a thumbprint. But she still refused. And she was she was really upset about this. And so then the Qadi realizes that she really just wanted to be divorced. She was done with Makame. She was tired of him. She wanted to be divorced. And so what he told her through kind of a long there was lots of imploring. The main clerk was telling her she'd be in contempt of court if she didn't sign. This was the judge's order. You have to sign. And then the Qadi tries a different tactic. He says, you can be divorced. All you have to do is break the terms of the reconciliation. And so he's pointing at this, and he said, it's right there. All you have to do. Let me see if I have a draft of the article. This is from right here. Let me see if I can find the phrase. It was kind of amusing, to me, as not having to be embroiled in this nasty case. But so he says to her, the right is yours, he said, in a straightforward explanation of the formulaic reconciliation terms and the consequences of neglecting them. He declared that Khuluu was her right. Quote, it is your right to purchase the divorce if you don't fulfill the terms. And if your husband doesn't fulfill them, then you dissolve the marriage through the court order, which he implied. And so basically, he was telling her to break this immediately. And so that's how she could get her divorce. And so he was insisting that it was her right, that Khuluu was her right. And all she had to do was break the terms and therefore assume fault. So she had to make the marriage fail. And how she would do that is by just breaking this reconciliation order. And I saw people do this all the time. Like, you have to return to your husband. The woman decides, I'm not going back, so she comes in the next day with the money to buy her divorce. I did see this happen more than once, that she gets the Mtesi did not come back the next day. I never knew what happened with Mtesi and Makame. But so that's exactly what he was telling her to do, that she could just break it. She could break it, and she could come back and buy her divorce the next day. So, yes.
How does she buy the divorce? She's complaining not having money.
Yes, exactly. That is a very tricky. Yeah, usually that's exactly the problem, is that most women would not have that money readily available. And so usually what people would do is they would borrow from family or relatives. So that's, and again, very few women would have the cash ready, even if the mahari wasn't huge. But that's when women were able to come the next day with money in hand. They would usually be with family members who'd supported them. And so it'd be kind of a family effort to get enough money. And women usually came with their family members. Men did too. And I never saw anyone's parents or elders. Even if, you could be 50 years old and you're still coming with your elders to support you, and the Qadis, talking to your elders and referring to you as a child. I never saw any elders not support the women. They were nobody was for keeping them in the marriage. It was the elders were, I can't even think of an example where the elders were not on the side of, unless I saw a few cases where daughters were suing their fathers for the right to marry, but in that case, the elders were not necessarily supporting the daughter. But in these cases, the family is always supportive. So that would be the way that you'd have to raise money. So, yeah, but that's exactly the problem, is that it can be incredibly expensive. All right. Okay. So another case. So this is from the other court, and what I've seen in this case is that the Qadi in that case
also viewed hulu as essentially punitive. But for that reason, he didn't want to use it. So he almost never used it because he didn't want to punish women. And he was just this, well, he's this very charismatic, very sort of outgoing man. The other Qadi is wonderful. He passed away about 10 years ago, but he was shy and reserved, also a wonderful person. But this Qadi was, he would explain that it was really hard for him to be fair in court because he was so sympathetic to the plight of rural women. And he really viewed women as being in this situation where they were, constantly subject to the emotional abuse of men or these kind of willy-nilly divorces happening. And so for him, the way he explained hulu to me is that he doesn't use it specifically because it is punitive, because it imposes that burden on the wife to have to pay for a divorce. He also was not a fan of reconciliation efforts, and he was really ready to rule on divorce right away. And so he would tell me, well, if a couple's coming in and this is the last step in the whole process of resolving disputes, and this is something I've written about before, but going to the Qadi's court is really the last step. And so he would say, if they're here, that means they've tried everything else, and there's no way to save this marriage. And so he was so if women came in asking for a divorce, he'd go through the process that you needed to do, call the husband in, call in witnesses, etc., and he would be very willing to go for a divorce, more so than the other Qadi who really wanted to fix marriages. So in this case, what happened in this case was the husband, so a husband and a wife, were in court, and the husband turns out, it's not going well, and the husband decides to ask for hulu from the Qadi. And so he tells the Qadi that he wants a hulu divorce. He wants his wife to pay him for the divorce. And this would really set this Qadi up. He really did not like it if husbands brought up hulu because he thought it was really greedy and really spiteful. And so here's an excerpt from a ruling involving a spiteful husband. And indeed, he wants to divorce her. The fact that the respondent wants the claimant to ransom herself, and the claimant was the wife in this case. I'm going to use the Swahili term kujikomboa, which is to ransom yourself, which is another way of talking about hulu, is a sign that he does not want her except for spite, in order to deprive her of her rights and get more benefits. The law establishes hulu, but not in this way. Rather, it's appropriate in a claim in which the claimant hates him. Excuse me. Rather, it is appropriate in sorry, I have lots of. I can't even read my own translation here, but you can see I've added. I've tried to make it more clear by adding some extra English terms. Let's see. Rather, it is appropriate in a claim in which the claimant hates him. The husband, without the respondent having caused the claimant any harm. Indeed, when the prophet ruled that the wife could return the farm to her husband, that was in fact her mahari. The husband had not caused his wife any harm. By this logic, the claimant cannot be punished, so that means the wife in this case, cannot be punished, which I take to mean divorce through hulu, me, for the mistakes of the respondent, because truly he cast his wife aside with hunger, so he was not supporting her. That's different from the claim that he brought. Therefore, the court finds that the permanence of this marriage harms the claimant because her husband fails to meet her basic needs. Therefore, the court has separated them from each other and the marriage is dissolved. And so he dissolved it through fusk. So in this case, he very clearly determined that the husband was at fault. He was causing the harm in the marriage. And so he dissolved it through fusk because the husband was the one who failed in the marriage by not supporting his wife. In another case, he used this wonderful phrase, money makes us drunk. Another husband had asked for hulu and he just thinks it's really greedy. And so he went into a lecture to the husband about how money makes us drunk. We get drunk with greed. And so he absolutely did not approve the husband's requests for hulu. All right. So I've also looked at hulu in the appellate courts in Zanzibar. Not as much. I have limited data, and I've never done any ethnographic research in the appellate courts, but I do have records. I have records from the 90s and early 2000s, and then I've got the Zanzibar High Court does make some now makes some cases available on the website, which is wonderful. And so I'll look at one case that, again, I did not do ethnographic research for this case like I did with the others, but I have the text of the ruling because they're available on the High Court website in Zanzibar. All right, so what I've noticed is that so there's a couple different levels of appeal in Zanzibar, and actually switched in 2003. But the district Islamic courts can appeal to an appeals Qadi, who used to just be the chief Qadi, and then decisions from that would go to the High Court of Zanzibar, which is not an Islamic court, and would stop there. It wouldn't go to Tanzanian court. Now appeals go from the primary or the district Islamic courts to one of two appeals Qadis, then from there to the chief Qadi, and then from there to the High Court. So
Anyway, so what I've noted, again, before this extra level of appeal was instituted in, I think, 2003, 2005, I can't remember off the top of my head, what I've noted was that the chief qadi very frequently used hula to effect divorces when women were appealing decisions from the district level in which they didn't get a divorce. And again, I don't have ethnographic data to back this up, but I have noticed that it's very, very common. So frequently they're recorded as the chief qadi decides that a woman can hula her divorce when she appeals a decision from the lower court in which she didn't get a divorce. So this case was interesting because this was actually appealed to the High Court from the Chief Qadi. The Chief Qadi had ruled for hulu, upholding the ruling, and the Chief Justice in the High Court, again, who are not Islamic judges, but do have advisors who are experts in Islamic law. So the Chief Justice actually overturned the Qadi's ruling and upheld the ruling of the Court of First Instance, or what I'm calling Court of First Instance, District Court, Primary Court. Sorry, I'm using those interchangeably here. I probably should have just stuck with one. So upholding Fusk and citing the husband's failure in the marriage. And so this is just a short excerpt from that. It appears that the appellant is a very deceitful person and is not ready to be with a wife because he failed to perform the necessary duties of marriage, such as providing a residence, food, and clothing. For this reason, the court denies his appeal. And in this case, it was a husband appealing and asking for hulu. And the chief qadi had, was that how it worked? I can't remember again. I have to go back and look at all the documents. But again, the chief court is denying that, going back to fuss because it was the husband's failure. So there's still that association of hulu with the woman's fault and fuss with the man's fault, or with the husband's fault. And again, I have not encountered anything that I would term no-fault divorce yet in Zanzibar, but maybe. Okay, so in summary, so as we can see, hulu is primarily a judicial divorce in Zanzibar, and I'm using that term again a little bit differently from, say, the Egyptian case, because this is a judge deciding that hulu is appropriate. It's not responding to a woman's request or a man's request for hulu. It's a judge deciding that hulu is appropriate in a particular case. And so why don't Zanzibari women request hulu in filing for divorce? It might be kind of obvious by now, but first of all, because it's really expensive. So the mahari is normally paid promptly, not 100% of the time, but it's very frequently paid promptly. So for a woman to buy her divorce, she would have to come up with quite a lot of cash to return for her husband. Also, there is this very strong association with fault. So hulu, if a woman is requesting hulu, it's very strongly associated with fault in the Zanzibari context. So a woman would be coming in and, culturally speaking, would be admitting that she was at fault in the marriage. So a woman who's filing for divorce wants to show her husband is at fault, and that is why she doesn't want to stay in the marriage. And so again, very, very uncommon. Only 2 cases out of those 1,200 open since 1979. Since 1979 was a woman specifically asking for hulu. And then, of course, fasihi, or even a unilateral talaka from her husband, is seen as a far better option. And so, women might coax their husbands into just divorcing them unilaterally. That certainly happens, though I don't usually see women admitting that they've kind of, antagonize their husbands with specific attempt to get him to divorce her, though I have written about women bringing in impotence claims to the court and accusing their husbands of impotence, and how those always end up is the husband agrees to divorce her rather than go submit to a hospital to get tested. So that's kind of and again, in terms of the motivation, I'm not sure that is why the women brought forward the impotence claims, but usually the husband will not submit to any form of examination, and so will and all the ones I've studied, and it's not a lot, the husband basically agrees to, okay, I'll just divorce you, and then the woman usually goes home happy. And then the fusk is considered a good option as well. Okay, so why do judges understand it as punitive? So this is a little bit more complicated. So again, we see that the hulu and the fusk are parallel fault-based divorces. So they're really associated with who is at fault in the breakdown of the marriage. Noted Zanzibari Islamic scholar Sheikh Salah Abdullah Al-Farsi, who translated the Quran into Swahili, I think born in 1912, died in 1985 or thereabouts. He has a very well-known manual, Ndoa Talaka na Amrisho Yake, so Ndoa, marriage and divorce, and their requirements, or their, kind of the instructions for marriage and divorce. And in a passage in this very well-known and very widely available text, he specifically associates hulu with the woman's fault. And I don't think, oops, the mouse. I don't think I have time to read it, but I have it with me, so if anyone wants to see it. Here, I can read that. So it's a very strong association here. And even though I didn't see the judges specifically citing this scholar, he's very well known, and they certainly are familiar with his works. In their rulings, they very rarely cited anything other than the Quran or the Hadith. Occasionally, they would cite Shafi legal texts. I should have mentioned that before, but this is Zanzibar today. All the judges are Shafi Qadis. So in the past, there were a lot of Ibadi Qadis during the Omani Sultanate period, but today everybody's trained in the Shafi madhab, though most of the judges I've talked to say they would, if litigants requested them using another madhab, they would, but I haven't seen that happen in the courts that I've been working in. But they'll sometimes cite Shafi sources as well, but mostly the Quran and Hadith literature. Okay, and then also, one thing I wanted to note is that it's also clearly viewed as a woman's right, that even though it's viewed as something that is, it's a fault-based divorce, but also a woman's right, but as we saw with Sheikh Hamid's court, it's a right that a reviewer of this article this is coming from referred to, I love the phrasing, a right that entails sacrifice, so that's exactly what it is. So in Mtesi's case, she could have a divorce immediately, but she would have to assume the fault in that case by breaking the terms of the reconciliation and then compensating her husband for the divorce. So it was her right, but it entails quite a bit of sacrifice, again, by assuming fault for the breakdown of the marriage and also financially compensating her husband. Okay, so then the contemporary comparative context, what I've noted is that judicial hula in Zanzibar is very different from judicial hula in the third, what I was referring to as the third wave states, or states that have introduced legal reform that are specifically directed at making divorce more equitable between men and women. And then the two primary cases that I've looked at in comparison are the Egyptian case since the 2001 law, and then in Pakistan with Carol and Holden's work have done work there. But it is similar in that the husband's consent is never necessary. And this is certainly a legal debate that legal scholars have debated for a long time, whether or not the husband's consent is necessary in hula. In Zanzibar, I've never seen it even brought up. It's not, in my experience, it hasn't been debated. I mean, in the courts where I've worked, nobody's debating it at all. No one cares at all what the husband wants. The husband's consent has never been required for either a fusk or a hulu. So the judges, the qadis who actually practice in courts in Zanzibar don't really care what the husband thinks about this. So the husband's consent is certainly not necessary. However, where I see parallels are in states that have not reformed law or prior to introducing legal reform. So Morgan Clark's work in Lebanon, it's not something he's written a lot on, but it's a very clear association in the courts with hulu with a wife's fault. And then tafriq is a dissolution of the marriage I mean, it's really similar to how fusk is used in Zanzibar, though I don't see people using the term tafriq. Usually people are, in Zanzibar, the qadis are just using hula or fusk in the court that I've been working in. Palestine, prior West Bank Palestine with Annalise Moore's work, prior to the Jordanian Reformation or legal reforms in the 2000s, it was also clearly associated with the wife's fault. Hulu was associated with a wife's failure or perceived failure in the breakdown of the marriage, and also, like the Lebanese case, tafriq with the husband's fault. And these are both states prior to modern legal reforms. So the Ottoman Code of 1917, is that right? That would have been relevant in both of these cases. All right, and then and so one of the things that I've noted, or we've noted, I guess, the group of us who are working on this, that when we frame hula as simply a divorce by women's prerogative or even by mutual consent, it's really overlooking the way that judges may be using hula unilaterally as a judge, I guess, but using it as a type of judicial divorce that is not responding to either the specific request of the wife or the husband. Also, Sylvia Vadek's work in India has shown how husbands will specifically request hula, and again, sometimes I've seen that in Zanzibar, but she's looked at cases where husbands see this as beneficial to them because either they don't need to fulfill their mahari to the gift of the mahari to the wife, the mahar to the wife, or they get that back. So again, we miss out how judges and sometimes husbands are using this type of divorce. All right. I think I've kind of already said, the same phrase there. Sorry for sloppy PowerPoint. Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused. The mahar, she returns the mahar or the mu'akhar? You know what I mean? Like there is.
They don't have them. She said they don't have the mu'akhar in Zanzibar. They pay it all up front.
And it's only, and the term isn't different in Swahili. It's just mahari, which I take from the mahar, which is so.
What about, do you have any idea in Egypt and
Yeah, in Egypt, okay, so let me think back to Egypt. So, yeah, in Egypt, it really ends up being quite affordable for women because they pay back what's recorded in the marriage contract, and it's often just a token amount. And so there may have been lots of other gifts. And so this is one of the things that was, from what I understand from Sonneveld's research, and I think Mulki Al-Sharmi, I think, has also done research on this. But the women end up paying back very, very little. I mean, they may be forfeiting, but whatever was paid promptly, it could have been just, a string of jasmine or something like that, but something lovely and romantic and beautiful. And so it's usually very little that they end up, they might be forfeiting any future, any deferred mahar, but from what I understand from Sonneveld's research, that might never be forthcoming anyway. So it's not a huge financial burden for women.
Does she give up the mu'akhar?
Which is that? Is that the deferred?
Is it the deferred?
I don't. That's you
That's
tell.
when you get divorced, a woman.
Yes.
it's in-
Yeah. She would be forfeiting
have
the.
to give this,
She would have to she would have to give that up. So, but she would, in terms of what the immediate in terms of actually, money or property changing hands, it's usually very small. It's whatever's recorded is the prompt. And so it could be, and from what I understand in the Egyptian case, it's, a woman might not actually ever be counting on getting the deferred dower anyway. So it from the research that's been done there, I didn't get the sense that was something that women were thinking about as a major sacrifice when they were going to go request hula. So if that was clear. So anyhow, and just in terms of concluding, just encouraging socio-legal scholars looking at Islamic law, when possible, to look beyond the courtroom in terms of the relationship between legal principles and local practice. So in Zanzibar, hula is definitely understood in light of women's and men's responsibilities in the marriage, what they're responsible for, and what constitutes failure to maintain that marriage agreement. And then, of course, the mahar, in terms of when, whether you have a deferred or prompt or both. In terms of the marriage gift is important as well. And then here, this probably seems really, really obvious. I'm sure this is super obvious, but something we also should consider is how much flexibility qadis or other judges who may be applying Islamic law have in terms of what they can do in the courtroom. So, and again, I see far more similarities, which is, again, not surprising, in places that don't have a family law code or statutory laws on marriage and divorce, in terms of how, even in different madhabs, in terms of how judges are determining when hula is appropriate and when not. So I think that's all I have. I think that was my last slide. Thank you. Asante. Yes.